All right, welcome everyone. I know a lot of faces and lots of names. I am glad y'all are here. This is one of my favorite workshops. I mean, they're all great. I'll enjoy them all, but this is one that I get a lot out of every time I do it, and I hope y'all get a lot out of it too. So we're going to look at this myth of the learning styles, and I hope you take away from today how misleading it is, and a little bit about how you are going to perhaps incorporate some of the ideas from today in your own classroom, and also maybe how you think about what you do as a learner yourself. So what we'll be looking at is what some of the learning styles are, what are they, models of them, examples, kind of a little bit of the history and what the research says about bad stuff, bad history, and what to do instead, particularly things that you as an instructor, as a TA, can do in the classroom that really does get to some of those issues. So, of course, those of you who know me, there are memes. So I love this meme. If y'all know this is what the Housewives of Orange County or something like that. And then, of course, there's the cat. That's one of my favorite memes. But I wanted to show y'all, start off with a video that I think is pretty impactful because of what it shows how students respond and what they think of learning styles.
What kind of learner are you?
Oh yeah, I'm a visual person, so like
yeah,
I can see things. Yeah.
I think visual learning.
Visual.
I mean, like, I remember formulas like auditory.
Like, I need to be like interacting with the material.
I like to learn by doing myself.
Very hands-on.
Hands-on learner.
Hands-on.
So like if I have a model, I'd like to look at that and look it over.
Part of this video was sponsored by Google
Okay,
Search.
very short. That whole video is actually really cool, and I've given y'all a link to it in the presentation if you are interested in it. It's about 14 minutes long. But what did you get from that video? What kind of struck you? I'm gonna make y'all work today. People learn differently. Okay, what else? Visual stuck out a lot. What else? Yeah, absolutely. Where it's something that has really been ingrained in K through 12 and also a little bit in higher education as well. And it is what we call a neuro myth, and we'll talk about that. So yeah, and the other thing I think I noticed was they are absolutely one way, no other way, that way. And that too is a problem, and it's also a myth. So what a learning style is, basically, y'all have a good idea of it already, how you gather information, interpret it, conclude it, store it, really how it's coming in, what you do with it, and how you store it. We all have a particular learning style. We all have a particular preference, and this is what the learning style idea says, and we learn best with this information when it's presented to us in this style. So there's two components to it, which I'll touch on in a little bit more in just a second, but how we learn based on how it's presented to us. And by the way, y'all have all of these slides, and I'm also happy to send y'all PDFs of all this as well. Now, learning styles are different from cognitive abilities. So you have strengths and weaknesses in cognitive abilities, how you think about things, how you process information, and it is still also different from preferences in the way you actually receive this information. So learning style is how you learn, how it's presented, and then how you actually receive the information is a little bit different. So the way that learning style theory is used in higher education truly is these three steps, where learners show a preference for their style of learning. And one of those issues of preference is they are told you are one of these different things. Which one do you think you are? Or they're given a questionnaire like you guys did. Which one do you fit best? Then learners will show that they have a difference in ability when they're not using this style. And the third one is that learners will experience better educational outcomes when the instructor and the instructional design matches that learning style. What's the problem with that? Oh my God, we can't match everybody's all the time. It's simply physically, fundamentally impossible. So with that information, the message to instructors, to us, is that your students will learn better if you conform your learning techniques to their preferences and to their style. But so the basic problem then is, aside from we can't necessarily do that, there's a lot of assumptions in this statement. And it says basically that it's easy for, if you match your technique to their learning style, they'll learn. That's not how the brain works. The brain is very complex in how it takes in information, puts it into memory, whether it's long-term or short-term, and you can't generalize whether they do or do not learn based on a style just using a learning styles model. That's not how learning works. I mean, there are entire courses and books on neuroscience of learning, which are really interesting. Okay, so what I want to show you, we're going to look at y'all's results. I wanted to first introduce the kind of one of the original models called the VAC model, where your students are basically sorted into 3 types: visual, auditory, kinesthetic. And this assumes that the way that you get knowledge and how you store it is the same. And your brain has lots of different ways to store it. Your brain doesn't necessarily store kinesthetic information in a particular way compared to auditory. So that's one of the issues with that model. And it says, of course, that everybody has this best modality, which we'll see shortly that that's obviously not the case. And of course, teaching a student in that preferred method will improve their learning. It's not just teaching, it's the student putting forth their effort into learning how to learn, which is something that we will also talk about in just a second. So the second model I wanted to introduce that y'all did a quiz on, or a questionnaire, is the VARC model. So sensory approaches. Learning styles are categorized by sensory approaches, and that preferred learning mode has an influence both on their learning and their behavior. So now we're bringing in behavioral aspects into the model. So this is visual, oral, reading, writing, and kinesthetic as the 4 components. All right, let's go to the next one, Kolb. And not everyone did Kolb, but I think most of y'all did. This one gets to a different kind of perspective where you have not only these learning styles, but it's based on a 4-stage cycle learning theory, basically. So it's also influenced by both social factors that's going on in the environment and the cognitive structure of the individual, which basically is how they learn what they think that how they expect to learn. And so what this results in this model is that there's what we call a processing continuum, where you want to do it actively versus reflective observation, and a perception continuum, where is it a concrete experience versus an abstract concept. So basically, how we do things and our response to it. So looking at this, what the Kolb's learning style does is kind of put you, based on those results, into 4 general categories, where if you prefer concrete and active, you're accommodating, and those words come from the actual model: converging, diverging, assimilating. I hate the word assimilating. It has a lot of negative connotations to it. But what it comes out to is that everyone responds to and needs stimulus of many types to go through this cycle of learning. So most people do go through the entire cycle. They just tend to work better or stay in certain parts of the cycle longer than others. And in order to learn best, they need to use the techniques and the social environment that fits best with their preferences in order to learn as well as they can. So looking at Kolb's results, and I put the cycle here, that was interesting. So the active concrete, we have a lot of assimilating to reflective and abstract, concrete and reflective. So I wasn't really sure that there was a trend to this. Anyone was surprised with your results in this one? Kind of a weird model. You're like, what exactly do these terms mean? The way I look at it is, do I prefer thinking versus watching versus doing? So I did this questionnaire twice. So the one that I entered here, I believe, was this one, but I had done it last year as well, and I got different results. So, but what I also discovered was my very, very low was the active doing compared to the other three, which kind of traded places a little bit, and a little bit stronger in one way versus the other. So I'm like, how accurate is this? All right, so Kolb did update it from those 4 categories to a lot more. I'm not going to go through this. I just want to show you that it's still continuing to be revised. And I'm not going to go into detail of what the changes are, but he factors in more differences and really fine-tunes it a little bit more. So the one that I've liked to do in the past with some of my students is the Felder and Solomons. This is an engineering education professor. And what it does is he recognizes, which I think is kind of cool, that there are these continuums of these different types of ways that learners process and organize information. So this was mine. Let's look at y'all's. So STEM folks, a lot of sensing. And the way that this works is that you are on the continuum and you are either closer to one side versus the other. The closer you are to the end, the stronger you are in that particular aspect. So we've got some sensing. So sensing is on this side. The way this works is, sensing on when you see the columns here, the sensing versus the intuitive, sensing is on the left, intuitive is on the right. So we have more people, well, not really. Well, we do. We have more people on the left side, so more active versus reflective, but those that are reflected tend to be a little bit stronger. A lot more sensing versus intuitive, but then we have a few people who are a little bit higher. A lot more visual than verbal, which I thought was interesting, and a lot more sequential than global. All right. I hope you see from this, first of all, again, how variable it is based on your discipline, of course, but just different people in general, how they learn, how they process information. So the other thing I do with the Felder-Solomon is I give it to my students. So I teach a marine science honors course for non-majors, and I have them do this so that they then give me where they are, their numbers on those continuums. And so what was interesting here, so the H's is my data, the green is the active, reflective, blue is sensing, intuitive, visual, verbal, and then sequential, global. And this is non-science major. So it's a couple of interesting trends here as well. All right, so learning styles is a neuromyth, meaning that it is commonly accepted, but it's also wrong based on misunderstandings of how neuroscience works. And so it contributes then to poor practice in education. And I'll show you some of this in just a second. There was a 50 greatest myths of popular psychology ranked up there with the fact that ESP is real and handwriting tells you personality traits. Learning styles is ranked up with that. I remember when I was in like 5th grade, I did a scientific experiment on handwriting. Of course, they let me do it because I was learning the scientific method, but still. All right, so just a little history to see how we got to where we are now. In 1983, Gardner developed this idea of multiple intelligences. Wasn't necessarily styles, but these types of intelligences. Basically saying that what we think of as how people think is too limited. He came up with these 9 different types: linguistic, kinesthetic, musical, interpersonal, stuff like that. Just to really help describe that people in general can be many different ways. We're not all lumped into 1, 2, or 3. And then from that, the VARC questionnaire that y'all did was developed. And it was not a study. It was actually an observation by the person that developed it that there are some good teachers that are not reaching all their learners, and there are some poor teachers who are. Well, I wonder why. So let me do this questionnaire to figure out what's going on. And he basically said it had to do with the modes of learning of the student, and that there would be a fix to that. And then learning styles just tumbled from there. Why it's so why do you think for learners in general, why we accept learning styles as the way things work? Wishful thinking, emotional bias to that idea. That sounds like a really cool thing to be able to do and to see in yourself. As you said, intuitively appealing, especially by figuring out who you are based on a quiz. Students like quizzes. And the fact that they don't realize it's a myth. They have, and their friends have, this anecdotal evidence that says, oh, I am this way because when I studied this way, I did well on this exam. That's not scientific method, that is anecdotal evidence. And we like to categorize ourselves, helps us understand others, of course. And with that, it also shows that we are unique in how we learned, that there are differences, and those differences are acknowledged. Students like that. They like to see that they are seen as individuals. Now, for educators, why do we accept it? Yeah, so very easy to understand for you, for your students, to help the students who are struggling. Very quick fix. If I just do this, my students will learn better. If I just add this one thing, that student will learn better. And you've already put so much time and effort. I love this idea, the sunk cost fallacy, where I've already put so much time, effort, money into my lesson plans. If I just make a couple of tweaks, I don't have to change everything. Everything will be great. It doesn't really work that way. And there are a ton of assessments out there that you can buy to apply to your students that encourage teachers to use them. So of course, money always factors into it. Here are some of those 71 instruments and theories that have been used. I'm just going to show you. Oh my God, there's so many different ways of people saying, I'm this versus this, this versus this. So of course, you see all this and you're like, how do I figure out who I am? Well, the thing is that you don't. We're multiple ways of this. And for us to peg a student as one versus the other does a disservice to them, okay? All right, so the analyses that showed that there were problems with these learning styles model, there was a lot. So there were several meta-analyses that were done. I want to just touch on a few of these so that y'all can see why the research as to learning styles working was bad. There was a 1987 article that analyzed 39 of that very first one, the VAC studies. No significant effect. Using the VAC approach, visual, audio, oral, kinesthetic. If they did show a positive effect, turns out that research had major methodological problems. It could be explained another way. They didn't have control groups. You're like, oh my God, need to know, always have control. And so when you got rid of those problematic studies, there was no relationship with learning styles working. So that was the first meta-analysis. The second one, Cofield got 13 of the most influential models, including VARC and VAC and a couple of the others, and Kolb. None of them have actually been validated through peer review. That's a big deal. It hasn't been shown that it's valid by applying it into other situations, other populations, anything like that. And so what he said was that we're doing students a very serious disservice by implying they only have one learning style rather than this flexible repertoire, okay? Educational psychology, no relationship was seen between subjects' learning style preference and performance on tests. This was a really cool study where they saw that the visual learners did better on all kinds of tests. And in this particular analysis, the students named what they were like 2 or 3 weeks before they did the test, so it wasn't biasing them. The students who used strategies that aligned with their VARC performed no better than those who did not. So even if you knew what to do as that being your learning style, you still didn't perform better. So that was an interesting study. And then an anatomical sciences study. Students did the VARC questionnaire to determine what learner they were supposed to be, and were given strategies to learn that way. And there were still no relationships between what they thought that they were, how they studied, and how well they did. Okay? So no relationship between those three key aspects. And students still did not necessarily study with the way their learning style told them to, and if they did, the test scores were not noticeably significantly improved. So interesting studies showing that these learning style ideas really don't work in real life when you hold constant certain variables. So research overwhelmingly shows no evidence that matching or meshing your instruction to someone's reported learning style, what they think that they are, affects them or affects their ability to learn new information. So there's no such thing as a visual or kinesthetic learner. And so what this means then is that while some of your students may have a preference of one way or another, because that's how it's been ingrained in them, anyone, of course, can learn that way, probably does learn that way in a particular setting with particular material, whatever it might be with their course. Okay? All right, so let's talk about why the research is misinterpreted. First of all, the media. And then second of all, just looking at the research findings, both with the media and then with perhaps other scientists, or just general looking at the findings themselves don't actually match what science actually says how learning works. So incorrect interpretation, just misconceptions in general about, as I've mentioned, about learning in the brain, and how memory works. Memory is stored in terms of meaning. It's connected to bigger picture. It's connected to past experiences. It's independent of modality. So you don't record in your memory necessarily a string of words, of definitions. It's incorporated and melded into past knowledge, into your bigger picture conceptual models. That's how memory is stored. And you have these different visual, auditory, whatever types of representations. You can't use that to learn something versus another. So you can't say, I will learn using visual information the melody of a song. It just doesn't work that way, okay? Now, the reason it's a problem for students is it makes them think that they're not going to do well. So that imposing of self-doubt. If a student thinks that they're not being successful, it's because they think, well, I didn't learn the way I should be based on my learning style. Pigeonholing students where they rely on it and then they don't do well again and it lowers their self-esteem. And then students may try to process information in what they think is their style, based on them not understanding that they need to do it across multiple modalities, even when that way that they're doing it doesn't fit what they're trying to learn in the first place, the actual task. And then they may actually avoid entire subjects because they think, I'm not good in math, or I'm not good in writing because that's not my learning style. And that's a huge issue. For educators, why is it a problem? For us, yes, you cannot accommodate all learning styles, and we've kind of touched on that earlier. All of those time and resources could be spent on strategies that do work. We're time crunch in our classes. We have a lot to cover, so let's not use things that obviously do not work. Also, some of our teacher certification programs still bring learning styles into the courses that they teach, into their certifications that they have teachers pass, which is a big concern. And some of our academic support centers and their products have students do learning styles in order to learn how to study. And that is not supported by scientific evidence, by the research. So in education, I want to show you this because The green are study materials of teacher certification where they reference learning styles. Red is where it does not, and then gray is just there's no computer-based tests with those to actually look at. So 29 states, the test prep materials on those certification exams include learning styles theory. 67% of teacher prep programs in universities require incorporating learning styles into lesson planning, and 76% of educators agree that individuals learn better when they receive information in their learning style. So again, it has been ingrained in us to think that way. And so this is why we do this type of session, so you all can kind of take back with you a reason to not think this way, to help discourage your students from thinking this way in class, okay? So what should we do? What can we do? I have 4 things I want to talk about. The first one is changing the perspective. So changing your perspective, changing your students' perspective as to the fact that they have abilities, some a little bit better, some a little bit worse, doesn't mean that you can't improve those abilities. It's not a style of learning. And so not to think of yourself as visual, verbal, or whatever. Everyone can think of words. Everyone can think of mental images. You can hone and improve that ability over time. You can learn how to critically think. You can learn how to creatively think. Tell the students about this research. Let them know that this exists, that they should not be pigeonholing themselves, and give students a toolbox to help them learn how to think, how to learn how to study, that they can then use for their classes. And I'm going to give y'all an example of this. We're going to work through one. There's another thing that works that gets to the idea that we are very diverse in how we learn. Your students are very diverse. What can you do that helps to address this but doesn't make you have to do all these different things for all your students? And it's called Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. This website, udlguidelines.cas.org, is a great website. This has been pulled from that. And they talk about and they give resources for how do you provide multiple means of engagement, giving options for getting interest, multiple means of representation, options for perception, customizing displays, alternatives for auditory information, multiple means for action expression. How? So physical action, vary the methods of response, access to tools and different technologies. So these, you may think that UDL is more for accessibility issues, perhaps with respect to disabilities, but accessibility is for all. Accessibility for all who have different abilities, and all of these changes that you make help everyone. Here's some more. So again, we're talking about engagement, representation, action and expression. So sustaining the effort, self-regulation, so fostering collaboration, options for language and comprehension, ways that you can do things in class and make changes in class to help address your learners and the different ways that they learn and their different abilities. Multiple tools or multiple media, guided goal setting, supporting planning, all sorts of really great ideas and resources that this website has. And what it then does is it helps your students to become learners who are motivated, are resourceful and knowledgeable, and strategic and goal-oriented. And so this helps you to think about, you're not doing all of these things, but you can incorporate a couple of them into your class that works for you, for your context, for the students that you have. UDL is its own huge, huge field that has really great ideas. Another thing that you can do is incorporate, and this also comes from the UDL as well, multimodal approaches. So a medium that supports the content. So thinking about what it is that you're teaching, what's a good way to help students learn it? Is it more visual? Is it more hands-on? There are ways to teach some material that is better than others. That's just simple ideas. And then based on that, what techniques are best for those learning outcomes? Thinking about not how you're presenting, but how do I get that information into my students' heads so that they understand it, remember it, and can apply it? Those are two very different things. So thinking about the techniques that work. And then not just content and techniques or media and techniques, it's also the assessment. How can I vary the assessments so that students are doing things that help them reinforce their learning in different ways, in different modalities? So animations, movies, visual note-taking, presentations, all sorts of different stuff. So this also gets back to the idea of universal design for learning. That's very much a part of it. And then learning strategies. So metacognition, what is metacognition? Those of you, thinking about thinking, okay? Thinking about how you learn. Students don't necessarily know that they need to know how to do this. How do I study best and why? What you want to do is encourage your students to try different ways of learning, try different ways of studying, and develop this, what we said, this toolbox of learning methods. And this is the idea of metacognition. What I wanted to wrap up with is ask you what changes you think you're going to make now based on what you learned here today. Are you going to, obviously, I hope you have done the first one. Change your perspective. Think you may incorporate more UDL, especially once you explore and see what all is out there. There's so much good stuff. Don't reinvent the wheel. Someone has already thought about it, how to do UDL for your discipline, for your class. Multimodal approaches, metacognition with your students. Well, I appreciate y'all being here. If you have any other questions, I'm happy to stay here and chat. If you can give me some feedback on the evaluation as well. You have the QR code. You'll also get an email with the link.